time coming in, you're right here at the beginning. These are, as they say, all-in-ones. So these are an overview of each section for the English that we're covering tonight. So if there's something that you see that you're struggling with and you need more of a deep dive into that subject or that particular topic within the English subject, then let me know in the comments. I really enjoy when you guys ask questions. Put it in the chat, put it in the comment section if you're on Facebook or YouTube. If you are on Zoom, try to avoid the Q&A. Use the chat because the Q&A doesn't scroll in real time, so that's a little bit more difficult. But ask questions, and if there's something that you need a little bit more explanation on and a little bit more in-depth practice, let me know, and I might can point you in the direction of one of our on-demand videos that you could go back and watch, because I've recorded several on-demand videos that you can access through our packages, and you can look at certain subjects is where I was going with that. So yeah. So if you have any questions, let me know. Does anybody have any questions, general questions before we get started? Everybody good? Can everybody hear me okay? I see some comments on Facebook and YouTube. Zoom, are you guys? Yep, okay. Awesome. Do I only teach English? No, I actually also do the reading section as well. So next week I rotate off. Next week I'll do reading, that back and forth. So we'll rotate off. Any other questions? All right, so we're going to go ahead and jump on in. So as I said, this is part 1 of 3. This is covering conventions of standard English. This is the first of the 3 English sections. And within this section, we are going to cover 3 subtopics. So we are going to look at E1.1, standard English spelling conventions and patterns. I'm going to show you some tips and tricks on that. And then using standard English punctuation, those practices, and then demonstrating correct sentence structure. So we will look at all the different types of sentences that there are. So up first, spelling conventions and patterns. So many of you have probably heard of a few common spelling rules like the I before E except after C. Does that sound familiar? Well, we're going to look at a few of the exceptions to that rule. And then we're also going to look at the rule for dropping the final E, changing the final Y to an I, and then also the rule for doubling a final consonant. So on the TEAS, they will give you multiple choice, and you might have to identify the correct spelling of a particular word, and you would need to be able to recall all these different rules and exceptions for spelling. So let's just go ahead and jump on in with the first rule. As I said, many of you probably have heard this, I before E. So when you are spelling words, if an I and an E are used, then the I should be located before the E. And I apologize, my autocorrect keeps capitalizing that and I just cannot get it to stop. But you should capitalize, I mean not capitalize, excuse me, I just got sidetracked. Then the I should be located before the E. So for example, if you have believe, B-E-L-I-E-V-E. So if you have an I and an E and they are going to be located side by side, you'll notice that there's 2 other E's in there. It doesn't pertain to that. But if the I and the E are going to be side by side, you will put the I before the E. That's just the general rule. Okay. So anytime that you're going to need to put an I and an E together within a word, you would put the I first. However, with the English language, it's never going to be just that simple. There are going to be a couple exceptions. What are those exceptions? And these are the ones that students tend to not know. And it's just because you probably weren't taught this. It's not that you just can't grasp this concept. We're going to teach it to you right now. So I before E except after C. Most of us probably heard this growing up. So if in a word you have the letters I, E, and C being used together, and they're going to be located together within that word, then you would put the I before the E if it was following the regular rule. However, if there is a C present and all three of them are going to be together, then you would not put the I first. You would actually put the E first. So, for example, with ceiling, Ceilling. See that? Everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. All right. And remember, if you have questions as we go, please feel encouraged to ask. Now, with the next rule, you will put I before E, except this is an exception rule. This is what on the TEAS you might see where they'll ask you for the exception rules. Is there a word that's an exception to a rule? So keep that terminology in mind. I before E, except when it sounds like an A. Well, what's that mean? Well, have you ever wondered why there's the rule I before E except after C, but then you have words like beige or neighbor? Well, you put the E in the I, you put the E before the I, but there's no C there, so why is the E coming first? Well, it's because when you pronounce those words, did you know that? You actually have to be able to, you have to be able to understand it based off its pronunciation. So with these words, if when you pronounce it, it makes the A sound, then you would put the E first instead of the I. So beige, listen to how I'm pronouncing it. Beige, age, neighbor. So I'm got that A sound right there. So when I want it to make that A sound, we're going to put the E and then the I. All right. Did any of you know that one? All right. So a couple other basic exception words. These are ones that you just kind of have to, put into your pool of knowledge. So there are some other words that are just basic exceptions. So you've got words like neither, weird, foreign, leisure, seas, and coding. So these also follow other exception rules. So just make sure that you're familiar with these as well. So this is something you'll need to do. Now for the rule, dropping the final E. When you add a suffix to a word that ends in an E, you drop the E if the suffix begins with a vowel. What does that mean? Okay, so let's look at a couple examples because usually it's a little bit easier to understand the rule when you can see it in action. So if I had the word believe and I'm going to add on the suffix, remember a suffix is what you add on to the end of a word to change the meaning of it. So if I add the suffix able, because the E is right here at the end of believe, and my suffix is going to start with an A, able, I'm going to drop this final E right here. I'm going to drop that final E. And then I'm going to have believable, Believe, I dropped the E, BLE. With the word advise, and I'm going to add on the suffix ing, because I've got an I as the start to my suffix, I'm going to drop the E at the end of advise, and then I would have ADVISING, dropping that E off. Same thing with guidance. If I've got an A at the start of my suffix, I'm going to drop the E off of guide, and make it guidance, Guidance. So pretty much what it is you just don't want to have two vowels back to back like that. And because the suffix needs to stay as is, then you're going to drop that E off of the end of it. Now, with the dropping the final E rule, you're going to keep the E on the end of the word if the suffix begins with a consonant. So if the suffix that you're adding starts with a consonant, and remember, I forgot to mention it here, but vowels are A, E, I, O, U. Consonants are going to be every other letter in the alphabet besides those that I just mentioned, those vowels. So take the vowels out, and that's what's left are the consonants. So if your suffix begins with a consonant, then you can keep the E because you do not have two vowels back to back. So nicely, for example, my suffix is going to start with the consonant L, so I can keep the E on the end of nice and get nicely, Nicely. Same thing with amazement, because the suffix ment begins with the consonant M. I can keep my E on the end of amaze, and that's how I would keep the E in my spelling of amazement. Same thing goes for rude. If you're adding the suffix ness, yeah, there we go. Then that starts with a consonant, and I'm going to keep my E at the end of rude, and I'm going to have rudeness, Rudeness. Okay, so pretty much, somebody asked if I was going to talk about NCLEX. I do not. This is a TEAS prep webinar. Sorry about that. So with, where was I? With this rule, pretty much, again, what you want to remember with dropping the final E, if you have two, you cannot have two vowels side by side. So if there's a vowel that starts the consonant starts with the vowel, drop the E off. If it's going to start with a consonant, then you're okay. Leave that E alone. Now, there are, as I said, a couple exceptions to dropping the final E rule. So a couple basic exceptions would be agreeable. So this one ends with an E. I am adding the suffix able, and it starts with a vowel. So the rule would say, oh, well, you're supposed to drop the E then. However, this is one of those exceptions to that rule. So I'm going to leave it because I've got that double consonant on the, not double consonant, I'm so sorry. That double vowel on the end. Now with advantage, and then if you add the suffix us, advantageous, that one is just one of those random rules that it's just one of those random exceptions, really. There's not really a rule to it. There's just a random exception that you leave the E with the OUS. So make sure if this is something that you're seeing, if you're taking practice exams or practice assessments, and you're seeing that this is an area where you're missing them, what I would recommend as a study tip is that I would just Google. That's your best resource right there. It's right there at your, usually you have a phone that has Google on it. Google exceptions to the dropping the final E rule, and just make you some flashcards and practice those. Because the more you can expose yourself to these words, the more that you'll start to subconsciously retain. All right. So that covers that dropping the E rule. Now we're going to talk about changing the final Y to an I. So when you add a suffix, so remember that's going to go at the end of a word, to a word ending in Y, and sorry, I read that incorrectly because of my side note. If you add a suffix to a word that ends in a Y, and that Y is preceded by a consonant, then you're going to change the Y to an I and then just continue on adding the suffix. What does that mean? Well, with the word beauty, for example, Beauty, it ends in a Y, but remember, I'm going to have to look at the letter before it, and it's a consonant T. So because of that, because I've got that consonant there, I'm going to drop the Y, and I'm going to change it to an I, and then add the suffix full. Beautiful. Same thing with worry, and then I'm going to add the suffix ed onto the end. Because the Y has the consonant R right in front of it, I'm going to drop my Y, change it to an I, and then just continue adding the suffix ed onto the end of it. So WORRIED. But with the changing the Y to an I rule, if there is a vowel in front of the Y, you will not change the Y to an I and then add the suffix. You need to leave the I because, again, we don't want to have double vowels side by side. And if you change the Y to an I, that's essentially what you're going to create. So, for example, with day, D-A-Y, the Y has the vowel A in front of it. So I don't want to drop the Y and change it to an I because then that would create a double vowel, D-A-I. No, that would change the whole pronunciation of the word. So, day, you leave the Y because of the vowel in front of it, and then you're going to add your suffix. Just simply add that suffix right to the end of it. So days, D-A-Y-S. Same thing with obey. Since the Y has the vowel E in front of it, I am not going to drop my Y and change it to an I. I'm going to leave it alone and just simply add the suffix onto the end of it. So obeyed, O-B-E-Y-E-D. Relay, same thing. The Y has the vowel A in front of it. I'm going to leave it alone and just add my suffix S onto the end. All right. Any questions about those so far? So essentially, if you haven't seen the pattern yet, really it's all about looking at where vowels and consonants are going to merge together and if they should or not. So changing the final Y to an I, you are not going to change. So this is another exception rule. You are not going to change the Y to an I if the suffix begins with an I. So if you have a suffix that ends in I, so ing, that's the one that I have here. That's pretty much the most common one that begins with an I. So if I have the base word cry, C-R-Y, the Y has a consonant R in front of it. So that would say that I would drop the Y and change it to an I. However, because I'm adding a suffix that already starts with an I don't want to have two I's back to back. I wouldn't have C-R-I-I-N-G. That would just, again, change the whole pronunciation of the word. So we leave it alone and just add the suffix right to the end of it. C-R-Y-I-N-G. Same thing for worry. It's got the R in front of it. We just looked at it with an ED, but the rule is only pertaining to suffixes that start with the letter I. So since ING starts with that I am not going to drop my Y, even though I've got that consonant R in front of it, because I don't want to have WORRIING. We just do not want to have that double I. So we leave the Y and just add the suffix to the base word. Same thing with supply. We leave the Y because we don't want to have a double I. That's as simple as what it is. Okay. Any questions on that one before we move on? Everybody good? All right. A couple more exceptions to changing the Y to an I. So a couple exceptions would be words like shyly. The rule would say that since the Y has a consonant H in front of it, that I'm okay to drop the Y and change it to an I. However, it's just a general exception that we just don't drop it. So you leave it SHYLY. But with daily, this is just another random exception. The rule would be that with DAY, because the Y has an A in front of it, that I would leave the Y and then add my suffix, but this one changes. DAILY. Memorize, memory. It has the Y, has the consonant R in front of it, but my suffix starts with an I. So I shouldn't just drop the Y and change it to an I. But this one, you'll notice that they drop the Y, they don't change it to an I, they just drop it off altogether. So they just add the IZE onto the end of it. See that? So again, these are just random exceptions that exist out there in the universe. And if this is something you're noticing you're missing, then I would strongly recommend Googling and finding just words that fall into this and just expose yourself to as many as possible. You know how they say reading expands your vocabulary? It's kind of the same concept here. All right, so doubling a final consonant. So this one's kind of a doozy, so hang on to your seats, okay? Don't fall out. When a verb ends in a consonant, you double the final consonant when a single vowel proceeds, so it comes before that final consonant, and the last syllable of the word is stressed after the ending is added. Ooh, that was a lot. What in good gracious does that mean? Well, for example, if you have the base word blur, blur, it ends in an R, so that's where you got a verb, blur. If I'm talking about it as a verb, like I'm going to blur that out. So when the verb ends in a consonant, so this one ends in R, you're going to double that final consonant, that R. You're going to make two of them. When a single vowel, is there a single vowel in front of it? Yes, it's that U. So when that single vowel comes before that consonant R, and the last syllable of the word is stressed. So this is where you have to think about not only consonants, but now you've got to think about what the syllables sound like. So blur, Hear how at the end of that word we really enunciate and stress that R, blur. So you wouldn't spell it BLURING because it hits all those criteria. It has a consonant at the end. It has a single vowel that comes before it. And then it stresses that last syllable, So I'm going to double that consonant that comes at the end. And I'll have blurring, BLURRING. Okay, let that sink in. So again, like I said, in this one, you have to think about, okay, what are my consonants? What are my vowels? Where are they located? And how is the last syllable going to be stressed? Is it stressed? Is it heavy? Or does it kind of fade away? Another rule for doubling a final consonant. There's two rules for this on when to double the final consonant. So if you have a word that has two or more syllables, so when you pronounce it, you're going to have two syllables to it. And if the last syllable of that original word is stressed, so kind of like how we heard the in blur, and that was stressed, this time we're looking at words that are two syllables. That first one, blur, that's just one syllable. But if you have a word that has two syllables and that last letter or the last syllable is stressed, then you're going to look and see if there's a single vowel that comes before that final consonant. And if so, you're going to double that consonant. So for example, begin. Well, that's a word that has two syllables, be and then gin, begin. So it ends in a consonant. So then I need to look before it and I see it has a vowel, a single vowel, because it's GIN. So it's consonant, vowel, consonant. So since I have that single vowel in front of that last consonant, and it's two or more syllables, and that last syllable is stressed, begin, then I'm going to double the N and have BEGINNING. And I would say make sure you know that one because I have seen that pop up. Now, we've talked about some spelling. What's the difference between the two? Oh, okay. So the main difference is that this one is focusing on the one, either a one syllable verb or just a verb in general. It's not solely dependent on if it's got one or two or multiple syllables. It's really based off the fact that this one is a verb. However, the second one is if you have any words that have two or more syllables and you're trying to figure out if you're going to double the consonant. But again, it's typically going to be verbs here. But the first one's just looking at, it's not really looking at how many syllables. It's just looking at, does it follow that rule of consonant, vowel, consonant? And if the last syllable is stressed, like blur, that on the end of that is stressed. But it's saying that if you do have two syllable words, a two syllable word, then you have to look at, okay, does it have the consonant, vowel, consonant? And is it being stressed? So it's really not too much difference. It's just looking at some of the syllables for that second one. Okay. So in begin, how is it two syllables? Because when you break it apart, so kind of think about when you're pronouncing it, you would say begin, begin. That's two syllables. B, that's one clap. I was raised on the claps. B, and then the second part of it is gin. So for example, if I say blur, that's just one syllable. I get it out in one breath. Blur. Begin, I got to take a little bit of a break. Begin. You see that? It's kind of like if you have the word between, between, that's going to have two syllables. It's longer than the word begin, but it's going to have two syllables. You're welcome. All right, so we've looked at spelling rules. Now we're going to look at misspelling of words. So there are a couple of reasons why words get misspelled. So this is another topic that they cover within this section. So we're going to look at reasons why words get misspelled so that you can figure out how to spell them correctly or be able to identify misspelled words, because you might be asked to do one or the other. So be able to find the correct spelling or to be able to identify the incorrect spelling. So reasons why we have misspelled words. Well, there are homophones, apostrophes, inappropriate separation or inappropriate joining of words, and then there's also compound words. And the four of these often attribute to reasons why words get misspelled. So what is a homophone? Well, a homophone is going to be two or more words that have the same pronunciation, but they have different meanings, origins, or they could even have different spellings. So what this is saying is when you say them out loud, they're going to sound the exact same. However, on paper, they're going to either have different meanings or they might just be spelled differently. Well, they're going to have different meaning, but some you could actually have pronounced the same and spelled the same, but they're going to have different meanings. Regardless, a homophone is going to have different meanings. And they typically will be spelled they'll typically be spelled differently. However, there are a few that are spelled the same. They're just and they're pronounced the same, but they have different meanings. So for example, with new and new in EW, so this is all based off of Merriam-Webster's definitions. NEW means to having recently come into existence. So it's brand new. It's just come about. But if I have new KNEW, that's the past tense of know. So to know. So I knew him. That's the difference. They're both pronounced the same, new and new, but they're spelled differently and they mean two different things. So this is where sometimes you have to use the context to determine the correct usage. So you might have to read a sentence to be able to understand, is it being used in the correct context? So for example, if I said, I read the book yesterday, that would be the correct way to use, or the correct spelling throughout the entire sentence. However, if I had put the word I read, or ed, the book yesterday, that would be incorrect. It's pronounced the same. I read the book yesterday. I read the book yesterday. It's pronounced the exact same, but it's spelled differently. And RED is what? Does anybody know? What's RED? What does that mean? Right here. What's that word mean? Come on. Y'all know this. What is that? It's the color. Good. Yeah, don't be scared. It's the color. So I'm talking about the color, and that's not the context in which I'm trying to talk about. So that would be incorrect. But another example would be if you had the sentence, I will, you wouldn't say, I will read the book yesterday. I will read the book yesterday. So this is an exception. This is an instance. Sorry, I get tripped on my words tonight. This is an instance where it's spelled the same, but it's actually pronounced differently and it means something different. So I read means I already did it. I will read means that I'm going to do it. So I mean, it's close to the same meaning, but it's still not quite the same meaning. So be careful of homophones. Then be very careful of words that have apostrophes. So words that contain apostrophes can also often be misspelled by the incorrect use of the apostrophe. So for example, and I have seen where they like to throw this in there. So some of these, for example, it's ITS. That is the possessive form of it. So if I were to say the dog lost its bone, whose bone? Its bone. I'm showing that the bone belongs to it. I typically you would say apostrophe S to show possession. However, with the pronoun it, it's an exception in itself, and you don't actually add the apostrophe to the end of the it and have it apostrophe S, because that's just how they deemed it, that you wouldn't spell the possessive form of it's that way. If you put the apostrophe in it, it apostrophe S, that actually changes the whole meaning of it. It's no longer possessive form. It's actually a contraction, and it's standing for it is. So if you say it apostrophe S, what you're really saying is it is. So for example, if I say it's a pleasure to meet you, what I am saying in contraction form over here is I'm actually saying it is a pleasure to meet you. What's the apostrophe S the term when the same meaning but different pronunciation? What do you mean? I don't think I understand the question. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Did you mean what is it called when it has the same meaning but different pronunciation? Oh, okay. So, oh gosh, my mind is going blank. So you have homophones that have the same pronunciation, just different meanings. So, for example, if you had bear, bear, I'm talking about the animal, like the bear. But if I say bear, bare, I mean like it's the bare minimum, a limited amount of. But what you're asking, that's a homophone. But what you're asking me about is the homographs. Let me make sure. I'm trying to recall off the top of my head. So let me see if I can find an example of that for you. If I can pull it. So if it's spelled the same like, let's see. BASS. If I were to have BASS, that could be pronounced as bass, like the fish, but I could also pronounce it as bass, BASS. And I mean, a bass like in terms of the in terms of music. Like the bass drum was loud. So that's what I think you're asking me about. So that would be a homograph. And I don't do a deep dive into that, but I do have, I believe there's one on-demand video where I go into really detail about that. So that's a homograph instead of a homophone. All right, so be careful of apostrophes. And then we have inappropriate separation or inappropriate joining of words. So, for example, if you accidentally separate words or if you accidentally join the words together, that can create misuse of the words. So, for example, if I say because, well, look at how I have a space right there between the two, because. That means to be the reason for an action. If you're going to be the cause, think of it as having the word the in between it. Be the cause. So you are the reason for that action. So for example, I would put it in a sentence like her dedication and hard work proved to be cause for her promotion. It's typically going to be when you have that to be infinitive attached in front of it, but to be cause for her promotion. What was the reason for her promotion? Her dedication and hard work. However, if I put the two words together, because this is going to mean for the reason or by the reason. So this takes on technically a different meaning. So because I had a flat tire, I was late for work. So the reason why I was late for work is because I had the flat tire. All right, so be careful of that. Now, with the last three that I have, a lot, A space LOT. This is used as a pronoun when you have A space LOT. That's when you're using it as a pronoun meaning many, or it can be used in the sentence as an adverb to mean very much. If I were to put the two together, ALOT, that's actually not a real word. Did you know that? Yep. A lot of people think that that's a word, but it's actually not. So you shouldn't use it because it technically doesn't exist. It's incorrect. And if you have a lot and it's combined together, but there's two L's, ALLOT, that actually means I allotted enough time to get to work. That means being assigned or distributed. So that takes on a whole different meaning as well. It changes the spelling. It's pronounced the same. So this is one of those homophones. It's pronounced the same, but it's spelled differently and it's got a different meaning. And this is where we're actually combining it versus having it separate in a lot. And then last in the misspelled words, compounds. So this we touched base on it with the other one, but this is really just general words. It doesn't have the same thing as far as if it takes different meanings. But this is just where people tend to not realize that they need to connect a word, or maybe they don't need to connect two words together. So outside, if I'm going to go outside, that actually needs to be one word. I've seen where some students think that they've grown up thinking that ice cream is all one word, but it's actually two words. The cream is of ice, so it's ice cream. And babysit, a lot of times people will try to put a hyphen in between babysit, but it's actually just one word. And then same thing with high school. I've seen where students think that there's actually supposed to be a hyphen there, but it's not. It's just two separate words. So think about what's the proper usage for hyphens. When should words be together? When should they not be together? And that kind of ties back to what I was talking about up here with a lot versus a lot. So should it be separated or should it be together? And you have to always think about, okay, what context am I trying to use it in? One more thing to talk about, and that would be singular to plural. Be very mindful when you are looking at test questions about how words change spelling when they are going from singular to plural or vice versa, plural to singular. So, for example, there's these just random off the wall exceptions. Man, when you make that plural, it becomes men, M-E-N. We change the A to an E. Goose changes to geese. So the spelling changes from a double O to a double E when it becomes plural. Cactus, for example, you're going to drop the US off altogether and you're going to just put an I at the end to make that plural. So I have one cactus, but I have a yard full of cacti. Child, that's the singular one, but if I have more than one, it becomes children. Life becomes lives. Box adds an ES and becomes boxes. Same thing with coach becomes coaches. So I would make sure that you're familiar with the rules of how and when words change from singular to plural. That's another big thing that I would focus on. I know it seems simple, but it's one that might get you if you don't expose yourself to that. All right. So any questions before we do a practice? We're going to do a cumulative practice now on this section. Everybody good so far? So what's the rule for cacti? That one really doesn't have like a set rhyme or reason. It's just that US changes to the I. It's kind of like syllabus. I think it has something to do with the US. I've never actually seen something in writing about where that's like a hard, fast rule. I just try to remember that usually if a noun, a person, place, thing, or idea ends in US in the singular, it's probably going to change to the I. So cactus becomes cacti, syllabus becomes syllabi. So I've just always kind of just clung to that it's just some random thing that happens with the US nouns. And same thing with child. Girl becomes girls. We just add an S onto it. But child becomes children. Kid becomes kids. You just add an S to it. And that means the same thing. If you have one kid and one child, that means the same thing. But to make it plural kid, plural would be kids with an S on the end. But with child, it changes to children for some reason. So again, like I said, I would Google that if that seems to be a problematic area for you. All right, so I've got this practice here. Here are 5 cumulative questions. I'm going to set a timer for 4 minutes. I'm going to give you a little under a minute per question. And then I'm going to mute myself so you can practice and put your answers into the chat box, comment section. I like to see how you're doing. No one else can see your stuff. I mean, if you're on Zoom, if you're on Facebook and YouTube, yeah, I think you're out there in the public. But put your answers in and then we'll come back and check. Okay? All right, so I'm setting my timer for 4 minutes right now. Ready, set, go. All right, go ahead and get your answers finished typing in. Okay, let's take a look. So with number 1, which of the following are spelled correctly? So we're looking for a word that's spelled correctly, but it has to show an exception to a spelling rule. And it says select all that apply. However, this one actually only had one that was correct. So it has to be spelled correctly and it has to be an exception to a rule. Well, leisure is spelled incorrectly. Hygiene, I before E, except after C. That one's correct, but it's not an exception to a rule. I before E. Conceit, I before E, except after C. That one's spelled incorrectly. It is an exception to a rule, but it's spelled incorrectly. Ceiling, CEI, it is spelled correctly, so check. And it is an exception to the I before E, except after C rule. So that's the only one that's actually spelled correctly. Oh, actually, let me go back to the A. I think I said that incorrectly. So leisure is spelled correctly, but it doesn't follow an exception to the rule. It's I before E. It's spelled correctly, but it's not an exception. Number 2, which of the following uses the Y to I rule correctly? Select all that apply. So this one was an example we talked about. So beauty ends in a Y, has the consonant T in front of it. So because I'm adding a suffix that starts with a consonant full, I drop the Y and change it to an I. So that one would be correct. It's following the Y to an I rule correctly. Obeyed. That's an exception to the Y to an I rule. So it's not changing the Y to an I. So that one wouldn't work because it's not actually changing to an I. Worried is spelled wrong. Hygiene, how is? It's not. Hygiene is spelled correctly in letter B of number 1. It's spelled correctly. It's not an exception. So with the number 1, it had to be spelled correctly and it had to be an exception to a rule. So A and B were actually spelled correctly. And no, wait, leisure is spelled incorrectly. Leisure is spelled incorrectly. Hygiene is spelled correctly, but hygiene's not an exception to the rule. So it didn't check both boxes. Yep. All right. And then worried, that one's spelled wrong. WORRIED. So it should have changed to an I. It just didn't follow the rule. And then apply, same thing. It didn't change to a Y. I mean, it didn't change to an I from the Y. So A would be correct for number 2. Number 3, which of the following statements is correct? So in the plural, so this is what I was talking about with the last few slides. Make sure that you understand the plural how they change their spellings. So why, there's no why. So the plural of these. So wolf would actually be wolves. When you have an F and you need to make that plural, it changes to VES. Knife, when it ends with an FE, that's the same thing. It needs to be knives with a VES. Fox actually should be foxes, FOXES. If anything ends with an X and you need to make it plural, you need to add an ES on the end of it. Same thing with words that end in CH, like church, becomes churches. So D, shelf, when it ends in that F and I need to make it plural, it becomes shelves, which is correct. Number 4, which of the following words correctly follows the spelling rule to drop the final E? So guidance, I should have dropped the E because I don't want to have those two vowels side by side. Advising, I dropped the E and just put my suffix with ing at the end. So I dropped the E because I don't want to have two consonants back to back. Argument, that actually is spelled correctly. So some people would be inclined to think that was the correct one, but it's an exception to the drop the final E rule. It doesn't follow the drop the final E rule. So that's the trick part of that one. And then truly, same thing. That's an exception to the rule. And then number 5, which of the following are spelled correctly, showing an exception? They really like, I've seen where they like to do that. They want you to find it 2 things. Is it spelled correctly? And is it showing an exception to a spelling rule? With number 1, it didn't say it, what spelling rule we're looking for. And in number 5, it doesn't say. So it's not telling you what the spelling rule is per se. It's just asking you to find 2 parts. Is it spelled correctly? And does it follow an exception to any of the spelling rules? Number 4, why is truly not correct? Because truly, see how it doesn't drop the E, and that one's an exception to that spelling rule. Because true ends in an E, and the suffix that we're adding starts with an L, which is a consonant. So the drop the final E rule would say, oh, well, I can drop the E, and it would be TRULY. But it's one of those weird, just random exceptions, and you leave the E on the end of it. Truly. So it's an exception to dropping the final E rule, not following the final E rule. That's the trick part of that one, and the same thing with C argument. So it's all in that wording. Is it following the rule or is it an exception to the rule? Yep. And then number 5, like I said, beige. That one should be, remember, I before E, except if it sounds like an A. So that's it's not spelled correctly. So it's an exception to the rule, but it's not spelled correctly. It should be BEIGE. Caffeine, it should be I before E, but because it's one of those exceptions, it's spelled correctly and it's an exception. So it's not following the I before E rule. It's an exception to that rule. And they did spell it correctly in this one, unlike with beige in letter A. Fierce, I before E, but this is one of those exceptions. It should be FIE. So, I mean, FIE. No, it's not an exception, but it's not spelled correctly either. It should be IE, I before E. And then truly, so actually, I should have highlighted that one too. That one's correct as well. Sorry. So that one would be B and D, because truly is spelled correctly. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. I'm like in a moment. That one's not correct. And this one, that one's not correct because it should be TRULEY. I was thinking about daily or something. I don't know where my brain was at. I'm so sorry, y'all. I don't think I had enough caffeine. Sometimes it takes me a minute sometimes to go back and think about my reasoning because I'm trying to trick myself or trick y'all and trick myself in the process. So, any questions on those? I know I like confused myself there with those last 2. So, if you ask me about why truly was incorrect, so that one is spelled wrong, which of the following words correctly. So that one didn't correctly follow the rule. So sorry, I confused myself on that one. Everybody still there? Any questions? Okay. All right, one more practice. So there's 3 questions here, and they are trick questions. So be careful on these as well. Think about everything we just talked about when we broke down those. And I'm only going to put a minute and a half on the timer and see if you guys can get that. Okay. All right. Ready? And go. All right, everybody good? Oh, I see a couple people still typing. I'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, let's get looking at it. Okay, so which of the following uses the I before E rule correctly? Select all that apply. So make sure to pay attention to those parentheses, select all that apply, because sometimes there might be more than one answer, but also be careful because as you saw on the previous example slide or practice slide, I had some in there and there was only one correct answer. So don't let it, just always do process of elimination. So with this one, the I before the E rule correctly. So deity, D-I-E-T-Y, I before E. So it follows, it looks like it's following the I before E, but that one's actually an exception to it, and it should be deity, D-E-I. Priest, that one's correct, P-R-I-E-S-T. It does follow the I before E rule, and that's done correctly. Same thing with brief, I before E. Feisty, though, feisty, that's an exception. It looks like it would follow the I before E, and it looks right, but then it's spelled wrong. So that one was two answers, B and C. Number 2, which of the following is an exception to the spelling rule of dropping the final E? So bake, that's not an exception. So think about if I were going to add ing onto the end of these words. Why is D wrong? Because while the rule says I before E and it doesn't have any of those exceptions like it sounds like an A or this I before E except after C, it's just one of those general random off the wall words that is an exception to the rule, and it's just spelled F-E-I-S-T-Y. I don't know why, it's just random. All right. So bake, if I were to make it baking, I would drop the E off and be A-K-I-N-G. If it was liking, L-I-K-I-N-G. So I dropped the E off of those. That follows that rule. But agreeing, if I add that ing onto the end, I'm still going to spell it A-G-R-E-E-I-N-G. So it's an exception to dropping that final E rule. Hope, if I add ing, it would be H-O-P, hoping. H-O-P-I-N-G. There we go. I don't know why that P stumped me for a second. But so it follows the drop the E rule. It's not an exception. So A, B, and E, nope. A, B, and C, nope. Try it again. Third time's the charm. A, B, and D, there we go. Whew. Sorry, y'all. A, B, and D, those all follow drop the final E rule. C does not follow drop the final E rule. So what if you say hopeful? Does the E doesn't drop? But remember, with dropping the final E, if it's following that rule, there's two parts to it. So if my suffix ends in not ends, if my suffix begins in a vowel, like ing, like what I was doing, then I would drop the E off. So hope becomes hoping, H-O-P-I-N-G. But if the suffix starts with a consonant instead of a vowel, then you would leave the E onto it. Remember how we talked about that one? Yep. So that's why I tend to go with a suffix that starts with a vowel, like ing. That's kind of like my go-to because that one kind of hits on multiple things. Because remember, we also talked about with that drop the E rule, if the suffix starts with a vowel, and then we specifically focused on suffixes that started with an I. That's why I gravitate towards the I one because it kind of hits multiple things. That's why I go with ing. That's my go-to suffix for that one. But yeah, so that would be the case. So It's a lot. It's almost like you're doing a mathematical equation when trying to figure out if a word is spelled correctly because you're like 1 plus 1 equals 3. Weird is an exception to the I before E. Yes, it is. So the rule says it should be W-I-E-R-D, but for some weird reason, see what I did there? It's W-E-I-R-D. Yep, that's one of those ones. Leisure, that's another one. That's an exception to the I before E rule. Which of the following are spelled correctly? And it has to show an exception to a spelling rule. So this is a two-parter. So we need to make sure it's spelled correctly and it has to be an exception to a spelling rule, not necessarily follow the spelling rule. So weird, as we just said, it's spelled correctly, W-E-I-R-D, and it's an exception to the I before E rule. Awesome, it's spelled correctly, but it's not an exception to the drop the E rule because of the sum at the end, adds the suffix that starts with a consonant. So it's just following the rule. Why did I say that so weird? Timely. It's not following it's not an exception to the rule. It should be time, Timely. So it's not actually even following the rule correctly, let alone being an exception. And modifying, that one's spelled correctly because with the Y, to change the Y to an I rule, if my suffix starts with a vowel, and this one's I for ing, and the word, then I wouldn't change my Y to an I, even though I have that consonant F in front of it, because I don't want to have that double I. I wouldn't want to have Modifing. I mean, it sounds fun when you're spelling it out loud. It's a hoot and a holler, but it wouldn't be correct. So you have to leave the Y. So that's why it's correct, but it's showing that exception. Any questions? Like I said, with this one, I would do study sheets and note cards. That's going to be your best friends. Oh, I do have one more practice. I'm sorry. So if y'all are up to it, here is one more big practice for this section. Y'all up for it? Before we move on to 2 point. Yes? Okay. So there was a question on Facebook. On number 3, is awesome not part of it? So awesome, that's actually spelled correctly. So that it is spelled correctly. However, it's not an exception to the spelling rule of drop the E because it's actually following the drop the E rules. You don't drop the E when the suffix that comes onto the end of it starts with the consonant. Remember that? You're welcome. Like I said, this is a lot, so don't feel discouraged. If you're feeling discouraged right now and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm not getting this, just think about this. In the last hour, you have probably learned a whole lot of spelling rules that you probably had never heard of. So if you're just like skimming the surface, which I've seen some of y'all's answers, y'all are actually doing pretty well. So don't let it get you down. Just try to go back and look at the on-demand videos that do the deeper dive, and then note cards and study sheets for these exception words. That's the best thing I can tell you if you're missing some of these. All right, so here's our practice really quickly. And there are 5 of these. So I'm going to set 3.5 minutes on my timer. We are going to try to test ourselves. Okay. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, it's okay. Don't stress yourself out. But we're going to practice our timing. All right. So I'm going to set my timer now. Ready and go. All right, go ahead and finish typing in your answers. All right, let's look at these. So for number one, for time's sake, I'm just going to give you the answers, and if there's any questions, I'll look at them then. We'll go through them then. Number one, that one should be A. 2 should be B. 3 is a select all that applies, so that one should be A and B. 4 should be C and D. And 5 should be B and C. Any questions on any of those? Everybody good? Number 3. Why is D not correct? Number 3. So C's, which of the following are spelled correctly and show an exception to a spelling rule? This one's spelled incorrectly. This word is an exception to the I before E rule, so it should be Seize. Any other questions? All right then. So for 1.2, this is going to look at standard punctuation. What does that mean? Well, we need to be able to identify different sentences or different sentence types, and then we need to be able to make sure that we know where the punctuation goes when using different sentences. Oh, there was a question. 5D, why not correct? 5D, again, feisty is Feisty. So that one's not spelled correctly. And so it's not following the rule correctly. It's an exception. So A and D are both exceptions to the I before E rule. So in order to be spelled correctly, they'd have to be DEI or FEI. All right. So as I mentioned, we need to make sure, sorry, we gotta keep on powering through so we can get through everything. We got 2 more sections to go. So simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. These are the 4 types of sentence structures I like to focus on because these are the ones you're going to need to be able to break down and identify when it comes to answering these questions. So just a little bit of terminology to catch you up to speed if you need it. Clauses. Clauses are going to be called, if you get asked about a clause in a question, this is why we need to know terminology. Clauses are a group of words that contain a subject and a verb, and they must express a complete thought. So they need to have 3 things: subject, verb, and express a complete thought. Now, if you have an independent clause, that's going to be a group of words that contain a subject, a verb, and they express a complete thought, and they can stand alone and be a complete sentence. Okay? Oh, I'm sorry. In my first definition, they possibly express a complete thought. The difference between the 2 types of clauses is going to be with an independent clause, like I said, you're going to have a subject, a verb, and you must express a complete thought because it needs to be a sentence by itself. It should be able to stand alone and make complete sense. So, for example, the rain makes me sleepy. What's the sentence about? It's about the rain. What is it doing? It makes. And what's the complete thought? Me sleepy. But with a dependent clause, this is where you will have a clause that has a subject, it has a verb, but it's not going to express that complete thought. So it's going to leave the reader questioning, essentially. So, for example, while the rain continues to pour down. Well, in this clause, we have a subject. It's about the rain. What is the rain doing? It's continuing. It continues. So that's my verb. However, if I look at it in terms of does it express a complete thought, while the rain continues to pour down. Well, what about while the rain continues to pour down? What's going on? Or is my laundry getting soaked outside on the clothesline? Are my car windows open? So what's going on while it's raining? So we're left hanging. We do not have that complete thought. Good question. That's a very good question. So the question is phrase and clause. What's the difference? A phrase is just going to be a group of words. A clause is a group of words, but it has to be a group of words that contains a subject and a verb, and it can possibly express a complete thought. So if it's a dependent clause, it's not going to have that complete thought, but it's definitely going to have that subject and that verb. If it's an independent clause, it's going to have that subject, it's going to have that verb, and that one's actually going to express a complete thought. But with a phrase, it's just going to be a group of words. So, for example, with a prepositional phrase, you would say, during the storm. Well, I've got a noun, but I don't have a subject and a verb. So, that's the difference between a phrase and a clause. Very good question. All right. So, independent and dependent clauses. Make sure that if you're not familiar with how to identify independent and dependent clauses, that you go back and study that, because that's going to make or break for this section. And we're actually going to visit it later too. So, now we need to talk about different types of sentences. So with that, we're going to talk about how many clauses and what kind of clauses each one contains. So if I have a simple sentence, I have one independent clause, and that is it. Okay. And if I'm talking about how to punctuate in general, how to punctuate a simple sentence, you are simply just putting a period at the end of the sentence. Okay. Now, if it's going to have an introductory phrase, there might be a comma or something in there. But in general, for a simple sentence, you are going to put a period at the end of the sentence, and that's it. So, for example, the rain makes me very sleepy. The rain is my subject, makes is my verb, and I'm expressing a complete thought. And there's only one clause, one independent clause. So I put the period at the end of the sentence. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. I'm all done. Okay. Now, with a compound sentence, this one's going to go one step further. So instead of just one independent clause, this is going to be two independent clauses. Simple sentence is an independent clause. Yes, a simple sentence is just one independent clause. That's it. With a compound sentence, it's going to do like it says, it's going to compound, it's going to combine two independent clauses. But with that comes different ways that you need to punctuate to show that connection. So this is where you need to make sure you understand the different ways they can be connected, so that you can understand the different ways that you need to punctuate. So for example, if I have the first independent clause, and then I have what we call a coordinating conjunction, and that's going to be one of your fanboys, followed by a second independent clause, it's going to require that I put a comma before the coordinating conjunction. So, for example, your fanboys are for, and not the preposition for, but for in terms of if you could substitute it out and say because. If you can say because, then it's actually acting as a conjunction instead of a preposition. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Those are your coordinating conjunction. Make sure you know those. Make sure you know that terminology. But if you have two independent clauses that you connect with one of those fanboys, before that coordinating conjunction, you must put a comma in order to correctly punctuate. So, for example, if I have the storm arrives this afternoon, I need to bring in my patio furniture. Those are two different independent clauses. And I'm using the coordinating conjunction so to connect them. And when I do that, I have to put that comma right there in front. Oops, I didn't do it. In front of that coordinating conjunction. So I have to put that comma right there. Okay. If you leave that comma out, it's going to be incorrectly punctuated. So they might ask you that on one of their questions. Now, you can also have an independent clause followed directly behind by another independent clause. And you would, if you don't have a word in between the two, you're just going to use a semicolon. After the semicolon, do I need to use capital or small letter? So you will actually do like I did here. Well, I'm so sorry. In my example, I use the pronoun I, so I capitalize because it's the pronoun. But in general, after the semicolon, if it's not the pronoun I, you are not going to capitalize unless it's some kind of proper noun or that pronoun I, you would not capitalize. So if I said the storm arrives this afternoon, it is going to be bad, I wouldn't capitalize the it there. I would just do the semicolon and put it in lowercase. But because I use the pronoun I, that's the only reason why it's capitalized here. So the storm arrives this afternoon. I need to bring in my patio furniture. I didn't put anything in there between them. I didn't put a word between them. So I'm going to have to put a semicolon there. And then last but not least, don't forget old tried and true. First independent clause, period. Second independent clause. It's not really a compound sentence per se, but I have seen where they'll throw that in there, so that's why I have this as like a side note. So that's one of them like trick questions. So just don't forget that that's an option too. It's not technically a compound sentence, but they might throw it in there and say, which of the following are correctly punctuated? And you're sitting there looking for, a comma or a semicolon to go in between them, but you could just put a period. That's when you're going to have to capitalize that first word. So if it's a semicolon, you don't have to capitalize depending on if it's a proper noun or the pronoun I. But with a period, you do have to capitalize no matter what the letter is or no matter what the word is. All right, so everybody with me? So simple sentence is one independent clause. Compound sentence is two independent clauses. Now, a complex sentence, again, is going to follow like its name, and it's going to be complex. So for this one, you're going to have one of each. You're going to have one independent clause and one dependent clause. And punctuation is based off of the order in which you put your clauses. So, for example, if you put the independent clause first and then you follow with the dependent clause, you actually don't have to put any type of punctuation between that independent clause and that dependent clause. You just put the period at the end of the sentence. So, for example, I need to bring in my patio furniture before the storm arrives. Since dependent clauses technically begin with what we call a subordinating conjunction, that's why you don't have to put the punctuation between the clauses when the independent clause comes first, because technically that subordinating conjunction right there is acting as the glue to hold them together. But if you put the dependent clause first, the subordinating conjunction is going to come at the beginning of the sentence, and you don't have anything to connect the two clauses. So that's why you have to put that comma between them. So if I say before the storm arrives, comma, I need to bring in my patio furniture. So if the independent clause, the one that can stand alone, comes first, then you don't have to put punctuation in the sentence, just the period at the end. But if the dependent clause comes first, you have to put the comma after the dependent clause ends before the independent clause begins. Okay? Any question on complex sentences? So if they're complex, there's more to them, so you got one of each. All right, and then last, but definitely not least, you've got compound complex sentences. So this is where you take compound sentences and you connect them with complex sentences, and you get sentences that are made up of you got to have at least two independent clauses. That's where the compound part comes in. And you got to have at least one dependent clause. That's where the complex part comes in. So you take the two independent clauses from the compound and add it together with at least one dependent clause for the complex part. And wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, you got a compound complex sentence. So, again, we have to look at where and what order we list the different types, or we put the different types of clauses. So for this first example, you'll see that I put before the storm arrives. Can you tell me, is that independent or is that dependent? Do you remember? Exactly. That is dependent. Okay. I need to put my patio furniture away. Is that independent or dependent? That one's independent. Good. So because I have a dependent clause coming before an independent clause, I have to put the comma in between those two. Well, then I've got one more clause. I need to move my car. Is that independent or is that dependent? Independent. Good. Yes, y'all are correct. So, since I've got that coordinating conjunction and in between these two independent clauses, that coordinating conjunction has to have a comma come before it. So, this sentence actually requires two commas, comma after the dependent clause, and comma before the coordinating conjunction used to connect two independent clauses. So be careful because, for example, you might see questions where the answer option is that they included the comma here before the coordinating conjunction, because that's the one that students pick up on a little bit easier and they gravitate towards that just more automatically. However, they might forget to put the comma right there. And if they do, then that one's not a correct answer. And they just tricked you. All right, so be careful of that. Now I've got one more. This is where I just move the clauses around. So just to show you a little bit of example, if I have the independent clause and another independent clause, and I've got still got that coordinating conjunction there, I still have to put my comma in front of it. But since I moved the dependent clause to the end of the sentence and it's coming directly behind that independent clause right here, I've got that subordinating conjunction connecting, and I don't need a comma. All right. So that's actually it for this section. This section goes pretty fast. So what I'm going to have you do is see what you've retained. Okay. And I want you to go through these 4 questions and I want you to answer these. These might take you a little bit of time because you might need to diagram the sentences and break them down, figure out what's a dependent clause versus what's an independent clause. And so I'm going to give you 4 minutes. So that's 1 minute per question. And then we're going to come back and check. Okay. All right. So I'm going to put 4 minutes on my timer now. Ready and go. All right, let's go in and take a look. Oops, sorry. All right, so number 1, that one's C. Number 2 is B. 3 is C. 4 is B. So C, B, C, B. Any questions on those? I was C wrong for number 2. So let's look at it. So choose the sentence, number 2, choose the sentence that is correctly punctuated for a compound complex sentence. So that means that we're looking for at least 2 independent clauses and at least 1 dependent clause. So, C. Sorry, something was blinking on my screen. C. He went to the store. Independent clause. Bought some milk. That's actually part of the same independent clause. And returned home. Because bought some milk, returned home, those aren't separate clauses. Those are actually phrases. So this sentence was actually listing 3 phrases. Went to the store, bought some milk, returned home. So this is actually, C is an independent clause. So just 1 independent clause, that makes it a simple sentence. So it's not a compound complex. Yep. So what probably threw you off, I'm not sure if it did, but I'm thinking that probably what threw you off was the fact that it had those 3 commas in there and it was separating out phrases instead of clauses. Am I correct? Yep. So just remember, we got to look for clauses. So it's got to have that subject and that verb and possibly a complete thought. But very good question. And that's why that was in there, was to trick you. Sorry. Any other questions? That was a great one. 2D is also simple. He went to the store, bought some milk, and returned home after. Yep, that's a simple sentence as well. As sub is 1. What do you mean? I'm not sure. I don't think I understand that one. As sub is 1. What's that mean? Mm. Oh, 2D, the subject is 1. 1 in 2D. 2D, the subject's he. Any other questions? All right. Let's see what we got here. Comma rules. So, in addition to being able to punctuate with based off sentence types, so simple, compound, complex, and compound complex, you also just have to understand basic comma rules. So, this can be when you are separating list items. Make sure that if you are listing 3 or more items, that you are separating by using commas. So, if I say I need to buy milk and bread, I'm only listing 2 items, so I do not need to include a comma. But if I say I need to buy milk, bread, and eggs, you need to put a comma between milk and bread to separate those 2 because they're not one thought together. And then this is where you got to pay attention because they might use one in one sentence where they're using the comma before the coordinating conjunction and following the Oxford comma rule. or they could be following it without the Oxford comma rule, which is also technically correct now. So, for example, what I mean by that is, yes, we're going to put that comma between the first two list items because there's not that conjunction and connecting them. But because you have this conjunction and connecting bread and eggs, the initial rule was that you still put the comma in front of the and because you're listing items. However, in recent years, they've established that as the Oxford comma rule, and now it's also technically acceptable to leave the comma off before that conjunction because technically you have that conjunction acting as a separator, so you don't absolutely have to have the comma. I personally will always still follow the Oxford comma rule because one, that's just how I was raised. And two, because when you're working with phrases instead of just words, it can make the sentence clearer if you follow the Oxford comma rule and include the comma before the and. So it's okay to put milk, comma, bread, comma, and eggs, but it's also okay to put milk, comma, bread, and eggs. So the first two right here are correct. The incorrect way would be if you leave off the comma between the first two list items. You just can't do that. You can leave it off before the conjunction. That's okay. But you absolutely cannot leave it off between the first, like if there's not a conjunction between those two. Okay. Then I mentioned it briefly earlier when we were talking about simple sentences. With simple sentences, because it's just one independent clause, you put the period at the end of the sentence. However, I did mention that if you have an introductory phrase or clause, you might, mainly just a phrase, especially if it's that simple sentence, that you do need to be mindful of if commas need to go in there. So, for example, if I had the clause, the introductory, not clause, the introductory phrase after finishing his homework, that's an introductory phrase. It's actually not a dependent clause. Don't get tripped up and think that that's a dependent clause. I mean, it still kind of follows the same comma rules in terms of you got to have the comma after it, but this one doesn't actually have a subject. After finishing his homework, we don't know technically who that sentence is about. We know it's probably a male because we use the possessive pronoun his in reference to whose homework is it. It's his homework, but we didn't actually have a proper subject within the sentence. So after David finishes his homework, that would be a dependent clause because I've got the subject David and I know I have the verb finished. I just don't have the complete thought. But with this one, I don't have the subject. I've got the verb finishing, but I don't have the subject. So that's what makes that an introductory phrase. But regardless, you got to have a comma after it. If it's going to start the sentence, you got to have the comma after it because you technically just need that separation from the independent clause itself. All right. And then if you have what we call a non-essential or parenthetical elements within a sentence, it's kind of like it's an afterthought, something you just added in there as an afterthought. It's not absolute necessary information that you have to have for the sentence to be complete. And it's technically like a dependent clause in the middle of an independent clause. So, for example, if I say the book, which was written in 1902, is still popular today, I took a dependent clause, which was written in 1902, and I put it smack dab in the middle of the independent clause, the book is still popular today. And because I did that, I have to have a comma before the clause and a comma after the clause. Pretty much what you're doing is it's actually acting as kind of like parentheses around it, saying, hey, this is just extra information that's been inserted. Now, I have a note here for you. If you have a dependent clause that is inserted in the middle like this, or even if it's added on to the end of the sentence, and it starts with the pronoun that, THAT, you will not put a comma. Okay? It's just tried and true. You just don't put a comma. If I say the book that was written in 1902, I don't put a comma anywhere. If I say the book is still popular to, well, no, you have to put it with the that right behind book. So that's pretty much the only way to word that. Sorry. You can't reword it a different way. Okay. Let's see. If the information is essential, do I need to use a comma? No. The comma is saying that it's not essential information and it could be taken out of the sentence. All right. Good question. So if it's just extra information and it's not vital to the sentence, then you do put the commas because it's saying, hey, this could be removed. Couple more common rules. If you have two adjectives that are of equal value, they mean the same thing, then you're going to put a comma in between the two. So the little brown dog. Well, I could have said the brown little dog. I mean, it doesn't flow as well, but I could have said it and it meant the same thing. So I put a comma between them. Okay. If I'm separating a direct quotation from the rest of the sentence, you are going to put commas to separate in whatever way you need to separate the quote from the rest of the sentence that's not in quotation marks. So what I mean is if I have the quotation, I'll be there at 6, and then I've got the tag, she said, at the end of it, that's not in quotations. I got to have a comma after 6 before the closing quotation to show that this is transitioning to outside of the direct quotation. And it doesn't matter if the tag comes on at the end or if it comes on at the beginning. So if it starts off with the tag and says, she said, and then has the direct quote, you would just put the comma after said. Now, as always, there are some exceptions. So with that rule, if the quotation ends in a question mark or an exclamation mark, question marks and exclamation marks kind of override commas. So you use the question mark and the exclamation mark. You don't use a comma. So will you read the book? That's a question. So I put a question, he asked. Now, if the tag comes at the beginning and I had said he asked, you would put a comma. You'd say comma, quotation, will you read the book? Question mark, quotation. So that's really only if the tag's at the end and it creates like this awkward doubt in your mind. You're like, oh no, what do I do? Well, just remember that a question mark and an exclamation mark are going to override a comma. All right. So we are trucking, we are rolling. I've got 3 practice questions right here for you. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do these, see how you do, and then we're going to come back and check. Okay. All right. Ready? And go. Think about everything we just talked about in that little bit of time. You know what? You can't hear anything. I don't know. I think I must accidentally click my mute button. I've just been sitting here talking and talking and talking, and I had my mute on. Oh my goodness. So embarrassed. I'm telling y'all, I should have put in a caffeine IV or something tonight. What was the last thing? No, you didn't. It was me. It was me. I'm just falling all to pieces tonight. I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm gonna be better next week. I promise you. I'm gonna like caffeine all day. What was the last thing you heard? Any of my answers? I'm guessing you didn't hear any of this. Nope. Okay. So sorry. I'm completely embarrassed. So I've just I don't know. I clicked the screen. I clicked the button. I don't know what happened. Anyways, so number 1 was C. Number 2 was A. 3 was A. And I'm guessing you saw all my little stuff up there where I was talking through it and just talking. Somebody asked me why 3C was incorrect. That was because 3C, that was because of the punctuation. See how there was a period and then the lowercase h? You can't have a period and then a lowercase h. If you had flipped these two, the period and then a capital H, that would have been correct. It's not common practice because typically the tag's not going to be capitalized when it needs to be connected to the quote, but it would have technically been correct. If you're going to use the comma, you got to have a lowercase following it for the tag. And then somebody asked me why 1A was not correct. 1A is not correct because that comma right there after old, you put the comma between the two adjectives, but you don't put a comma between the adjective and the noun. So that was why that one was incorrect. So sorry. I mean, really, I was going hard over here talking, just talking, and y'all couldn't hear any of it. Okay. Any other questions on that one? Now that everyone can hear me. My goodness. So after the comma, you do not capitalize down there. No. If it's a period, then you capitalize. If it's a comma, no capital. It's lowercase. All right. So I just did a whole spiel on this too while y'all were looking at the screen. So with parts of a sentence, this section right here, we are looking at correct sentence structure. So parts of a sentence, subject, who or what the sentence is about. A verb, you can have either the action verb, which is going to show some sort of action, or it can be a linking verb that's showing showing a connection between the subject and a description being made. But regardless, if you have a complete sentence, you must have a subject and a verb. And typically the correct order would be subject and then the verb. Now, sometimes there's a few exceptions to that rule, but typically if it's correctly formatted, it would be subject and then verb. We've already talked about clauses, so we know that an independent clause is going to have a subject, it's going to have a verb, and it's going to express that complete thought. It could stand alone. If I just walked up to Billy Bob on the street and said it to him, he should have a good general idea of what I'm talking about. If it's a dependent clause, it does have to have a subject. It is going to have a subject. It is going to have a verb, but it will not express a complete thought. It's going to leave you questioning and wondering, what are you talking about? Do you have your microphone on mute? What did you not tell me? And we talked about simple, compound, complex, compound, complex. Remember, simple, just quick review. Simple is one independent clause. Compound is two independent clauses. Complex is going to be one of each, so one independent, one dependent. And compound complex is going to be a combination of the previous two. So two independent clauses, at least one dependent clause. So at least two independent and at least one dependent. So we went through that really quickly, but what I want you to do is I want you to see what you've retained. And like I said, a lot of this carries over from the last section. It's just altering what type of questions they're asking you. So remember, subject is who or what the sentence is about. Verbs can either be action or linking. And then we want to look at what type of clauses are being presented. Okay. So I've got 4 sentences here. I am going to put 2.5 minutes on my timer. And then we're going to come back and check. Everybody good? All right. Ready? And go. Okay. I'm back. You can hear me, right? All right. Let's go. So number 1, the subject is children. That's who or what the sentence is about. Number 2, you're looking for a dependent clause. That one's going to be be. When the bell rang. So we have a subject, the bell. We have the verb rang, but we don't have a complete thought. When the bell rang, what? Did we all run out the door? Did we cry? Number 3, C. Which of the following is a compound sentence? So Mary went to the store, independent clause. Her mom stayed home, independent clause. Then it's connected by that coordinated conjunction, but. Number 4, which of the following is a complex sentence? So for that one, we are looking for one independent, one dependent. After she finished her homework, that's a dependent clause. She watched television, that's an independent clause. All right. Any questions on those? Okay. I think your question got cut off. You put what? 3A, yes, that's a simple sentence. And 4D, yes, that's a simple sentence. All right. Oop, my mouse is not cooperating. There we go. All right, one more practice. And that'll be it for the evening. You guys want to take 2 minutes? I'm going to just do 2 minutes this time. And then we'll come back and check, okay? Ready? And go. All right. Let's take a look at these last ones. So number 1 is C, independent clause. 2, compound complex sentence is, I don't know why that switched to number 1, but that's supposed to be A. Or number 1, whichever one you put. Number 3 would be C, and 4 would be A. Any questions on those? Number 2, yes. So number 2, which is a compound complex sentence. So I like to go through, I know it can be time consuming, but if you practice diagramming sentences, you can get pretty fast at it. Number 2, the A, or number 1, Mary went to the store, independent clause. Her mom stayed home, independent clause. There's a coordinating conjunction, but connecting the two, so that makes the compound part. Because she was not feeling well, that's a dependent clause. Fragment is like a dependent clause, yes. Somebody asked that question. With 2 or B, her mom stayed home, that's an independent clause. Because she was not feeling well, that's a dependent clause, but I only have 1 independent clause, and I need a second one for it to be a compound complex. With option C, Mary went to the store, independent. Her mom stayed home, independent, and I got that coordinating conjunction to connect the two, so that makes the compound part. 4, she was not feeling well. That's another coordinating conjunction connecting on another independent clause. So this one's actually missing the dependent clause. And then D, since she was not feeling well, that's a dependent clause. And then her mom stayed home is an independent clause. while Mary went to the store is another dependent clause. So I have a dependent, independent, and then a dependent. But for compound complex, I got to have at least two independents. So I didn't have the correct number for that one. Oh, you're welcome. Any other questions? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause my screen for a second. So it may go black. I'm not sure. Yeah. And then I'm going to upload our notes for the evening. Give me just 1 second. I won't mute myself so you don't think I've disappeared. Oops. All right, so if you are on Zoom, I just posted the link. If you're on YouTube or Facebook, I just posted the link. So you should have those. And at the end of that slide, I have included this QR code page with frequently asked questions. So if you're looking for more free live webinars, here's QR code. If you want to connect with us on socials, sometimes we do giveaways and freebies. Then if you want to look for any of those on-demand videos I mentioned, there's a lot of good ones that connect with tonight's all-in-one that are at this QR code if you want to access the question bank. And then if you need to contact us, I've got the email up there as well. And then last but not least, if you are interested in tutoring, you can do it either private or you can actually do group. And there's a QR code up there for you as well. All right, so anybody got any questions before we log off? Where's the QR code? So if you go into the slides that I sent you, you'll see this page at the end. But there they are. You're welcome. I'll leave it up here if you need a second. Oh, thank you. Next time, I will make sure to caffeinate severely before we start class. Next week, I'll be back on Wednesday. That will be a reading. That'll be reading part 1. So join in. That one is, there's 6 sections on that one. So that one might be a good 2.5 hours that night. So be prepared for that. But that one's a really good one if you need practice with main ideas and things like that. All right. Well, I'm gonna stick around for another minute or so in case anybody has any questions. If not, you guys have a great night. I hope you have a happy weekend, and I hope to see y'all next week. Oh, I had my screen black. I forgot to share. I'm just not even on it tonight. That's why you couldn't see. That's why you asked where the QR code is. It's right there. So sorry. All right, y'all have a great night.